Welcome to Finlos Loves. Eva has joined me once again, this time for a conversation about making mistakes. Except, in this context, it's less about the mistake itself and more about harm, how we react when we do harm, and how to begin to heal after harm. Everyone makes mistakes, and so everyone causes harm at some point. But when denial, shame, fear, insecurity, and anxiety all get into the mix, the fuck-up is what is made. The fuck-up is both the act and the person, an ouroboros of codependency and guilt. In this episode, Eva helps to navigate some of the reasons why so many fall into the pattern of the fuck-up, some of the potential sources for the pattern, why apologies often fall short, and what accountability really looks like.
I don't know how real and deep you want to get with this.
I mean, what's the point of doing it if it's not going to be real or deep?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, all right, well, let's just get real and deep, because even now I am feeling stuck in the fuck up mode right now, because even this is a compromise on your part, because an observation that you've made is that why can't we just have these conversations normally? Like, why do they have to be recorded and produced for an audience?
It's a good question.
I think it's a great question. And so as we approach the question of this, it's a trap, right? It's a mental trap that that people set themselves up for, this fuck up mentality. And so, like, even right now I'm grappling with it because I'm feeling those comments that we've talked about. Like, what is the difference between having these conversations, just you and me? There isn't a difference, because, or at least there shouldn't be a difference. Mm-hmm. You know, why should I be able to open up in this way for strangers?
Right. And sometimes even when you don't want to do it with people who aren't strangers.
Yeah. So I think that's an interesting place to begin, because we talk about a lot of our struggles as partners, parents, have come from mistakes. Mm-hmm. And it's not that there's any expectations that we don't make mistakes, because that's human nature to make mistakes. It's how we move on from mistakes without getting trapped in this loop. And I guess that's as good a place as any to sort of define what we're talking about, which is there's lots of different names that we use it. Mm-hmm. We can call it a poor me. The joke that we call it is the fuck up, because and why the title, that the art of the fuck up is interesting. It's because it has two parts to it. The fuck up being the person, and then the fuck up also being the mistake. Mm-hmm. And the person can sometimes let themselves become defined by the thing. And so that's sort of the vicious cycle. I fuck up, therefore I am a fuck up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not seen as an opportunity for growth in that moment, or even beyond that moment at times. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think, like, I don't know about you, but at the risk of sort of making these formulaic, I generally like to start by grounding the conversation in like what formative experiences of fucking up look like, right? Because we get a lot of those ideas, a lot of those, and I know that you don't like the concept of like where did I learn this, or like where does that voice come from, and it's also real.
Quick sidebar, because Eva and I had this conversation a couple of days ago. We were listening to, or Eva was listening to a podcast, and I was kind of picking up parts of it, and
it was on toxic masculinity.
Yeah, and the inner monologue. I was sort of bristling at the concept of whose voice do you hear when you hear your inner monologue, and my comment just being that's a very basic, sort of simplistic way of thinking about how thought works. So, I think that it is a useful tool. But yes, formative. Sorry to interrupt your thought.
No, I think that it makes sense to explain that, to explain where that kind of where that originates from even. So I guess like my thoughts, my questions around this is did you have experiences growing up where you feel like you got to experience people make mistakes and take ownership for their mistakes and grow from those mistakes? And what did that, if so, then what did that look like?
No.
Or yeah. Yeah.
No.
It's pretty straightforward usually.
No.
Yeah. Well, gee, I wonder why we're not good at this.
Yeah, no, both of my parents, and if my dad ever listens to these, I don't know if he ever will, but it'll probably be a little bit uncomfortable for him, but both of my parents were not helpful with dealing with how to learn from mistakes. First of all, I'm the youngest of 5, and my next oldest sibling is 5 years older than me, and I was left alone a lot of the time. Because my parents were divorced, and I would float between the two of them, and they worked full time and we weren't exactly wealthy, so there wasn't a lot of that sort of scaffolding because they just weren't around a lot. And my sister, we were raised in a very gendered house, and so my sister was a caretaker in the babysitter sense, but she always was very social, and so she was usually with a friend or with other people, and so I was just kind of left alone. And my 3 older brothers are all significantly older than me, so we would occasionally like hang out in the loosest of sense, but they were not exactly parenting. So no, I don't have a lot of childhood or adolescent or formative experiences with how to learn from mistakes, because consequences were always felt in very negative ways. My mother was she dealt with guilt and shame. So if she was never, for me at least, I mean, my siblings always say that I had it much easier than they did, which is probably true, but for me, when I made a mistake with my mom, it usually just ended up there are 2 versions of my mom. There's cold and warm. And she would just go cold, and she would distance and just be cold and not really communicate. Mistakes with my father were almost always met with anger and not punishment. Not consequence in the term of like, here is you do X, you get Y or Z afterwards. It was always just like, why would you do this? This is stupid.
Criticism.
Yeah. Blah 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 blah. Shame, embarrassment.
Yeah.
And a lot of violence in terms of physical presence and volume. Like, again, I was never physically punished, but
like verbal,
very verbal, and very intimidating.
Yeah.
So, I think this is a fairly typical experience, at least as far as people in America, especially young men in America, male-bodied people, is you learn to avoid it.
Yeah.
You don't avoid making bad choices because there's no consequence and there's no ownership. You learn to avoid getting caught, or
to avoid the punishment.
To avoid the punishment, or to obfuscate, or to create narratives to explain why you're doing the things that you're doing. Or in my case, I was left largely to be independent from a very young age. So even my experiences of mistakes were not, they were, I it wasn't bad for me because there wasn't that much of it. The most severe, I think the most severe consequences I ever received were from my siblings. And it was never because I was really doing anything bad. It was just because I was annoying them, or because I was being too demanding, or because I was a kid. And those were always much more threatening to me than my parents were. But then by the time I turned 14, I parented myself. My siblings had all pretty much moved out at that point, 13, 14. My sister's 5 years older than me, so she would have graduated when she's 18. So when I was 12, 13 years old. And my dad worked full time, and I never had a babysitter. And I've been working full time since I was 14.
Yeah.
So, when I think about it like that, it's no wonder that when I transition to adulthood, in terms of having to actually relate to other people, especially long-term romantic partner, long-term cohabitating partner, and Jesus, parenting, I'm not used to. I'm not used to owning mistakes. Not even bad behavior, but just mistakes, because that happens. And I'm definitely not used to growing from those mistakes. I'm used to, oh shit, I just messed up. I don't want to do that again. And if it happens again, I better fucking really try hard not to let anybody find out about it. Not that I'm a bad person, not that I'm doing things, and I think people intuitively get that. We're not talking about habitual deceitfulness or I've done pretty messed up things, but it's not for the entire length of the time that we've been together. So I don't know if that's answering your question about formative stuff.
Yeah, that's answering my question. And I think I think you touched on something really important, that it's there's a fear of punishment, and so we behave in ways that will allow us to avoid punishment, right? And I think for me, I had in some ways similar dynamics, even though I was not the youngest, I was the oldest. And so with that came a lot of sort of responsibility, and rather than just parenting of myself, I was also parentified, and so raising younger siblings. But my experiences, I think, were similar, with my mother sort of being like the cold, detached parent in that dynamic, and my father being yes, explosive, but physically explosive, very abusive. And I think as I've gotten older, also kind of a part of that my healing process and understanding of him and making peace with him was understanding that this was basically a replication of the dynamics that he experienced as a child too. And so, but yeah, not once do I remember them apologizing to me for the harms that they caused. And in fact, I remember that a lot of that explosiveness came at times when, like you, I was expressing simple needs, needs for affection, needs for play, and where, because of how maybe busy and stressed and maybe even worried they were, that they just didn't have the capacity, the emotional capacities, or people who likely shouldn't have had children. They didn't plan to have us, and having us caused stress. And my parents were the first in their both their families to have kids. My mom was the oldest of her siblings, and my dad was sort of like one of the youngers, not the youngest, but one of the youngers, the only male in his family. So, but yeah, not once apologized. And then my mom ended up, divorcing my father and starting a relationship with another person who did apologize, but only apologized as part of a very cyclical abusive cycle, to kind of keep you thinking that change was on the horizon. And so I learned that both things were kind of dangerous, that the apologies don't actually, like getting an apology seemed really important at first because I'd never gotten apologies, even from my grandfather, who was a good man. Like, he was genuinely a caring man, but his way of apologizing was generally to kind of sweep it under the rug and take you out to eat or buy you a gift. There was no actual. So I think I for a while, like, just hearing an apology felt like it might mean something, and then I very quickly realized that, like, an apology didn't mean shit, because it didn't come with change, and that it was actually almost more hurtful to have the apology as a, what else do you want?
Yeah, like I what more do you want from me? I've said I'm sorry. Like, isn't
Yes.
that enough for you?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, as we're talking about parents, and I don't want to make excuses for them, because they should have known better. They should have known what they were getting into. They should have thought about these things.
Well, we should, and I don't want to do the should have. Like, let's not should them.
Okay. I will grant them that they were trying to not replicate the harm that their parents had done.
Mm-hmm.
And the best way that they could do it was to sort of just not be involved to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Like benign neglect almost.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always been, I'm not always, I guess, but I am incredibly grateful that we've approached that. You have pushed very hard to be very mindful and thoughtful about how we parent. And so it is an incredible burden in the sense of responsibility. I don't want to say burden as in it's like a problem or as if it's something unwanted. I think it is work to interrupt that cycle. And it's not perfect. And again, as I see it and as I say it, my mind wants to go there. My mind wants to go to the, isn't it enough that we have provided a more stable and, subjectively happy home life for our children? Like, isn't that enough? What more do we want? What more should we expect of ourselves? But that's that little voice, right, that we were talking about before. That's the voice of the fuck up who's like, why should we be held to a different standard than our parents were? Eva's a very amazing person because they have the ability to sort of unlock these aha moments. So if you've never had the opportunity to have a deep conversation with Eva, I highly encourage it. But Eva was just speaking to the power and to the failings of apologies. Mm-hmm. And so as I'm thinking about the times that I have messed up and that I have tried to begin the repair through by an apology, right? And we talk about raising our kids, and one of the great tools that we were gifted through entertainment was on Daniel Tiger and the Daniel Tiger neighborhood show, and there's a situation where one of the kids does something wrong, and he says, "I'm sorry," and then one of the other characters, there's a little song that goes, "Saying I'm sorry is the first step. Now how can I help?" Right? And so it's apologizing is not enough. Apologizing isn't where it ends. It doesn't. That's where the repair begins, but not where it ends. And so Eva was a student of a psychology professor at FSU, Dr. Barato. Yeah. And one of the great tools that he gave to her, and I'm speaking to this through her experience, but one of the great tools that she acquired was the art of apologizing. Mm-hmm. And it was one of those moments where, and I'm speaking of it in a singular, but there are many. This is an organic process that takes time, but I'm a very slow grower when it comes to these sorts of skills. And so in one of my tantrums, as I'm we're engaging in these hours-long conversations, and we're not fighting, but we're on that verge of like really having a communication breakdown. And I'm sorry. I don't remember what the context was anymore. I've said I'm sorry. What more do you want from me? But then Eva, had to break it down. It's like that's not how apologies actually work. Mm-hmm. So Eva, I think it would be beneficial for people to know what an apology actually looks like. Yeah,
I'm so happy you brought Dr. Barato into the conversation. Yeah, he was top of mind when I was thinking about this topic too. And I think he was definitely happily one of the first people to really zero it in on this for me. If I'm, and I don't want to misrepresent, I'm wondering now, like, am I remembering this correctly? But I believe he told us that he studied to be a Jesuit priest for a long time, and
that's how I remember you telling me.
Yeah, and so he came out of that. He came out of that kind of a schooling experience himself, but then went on to work with like many greats, like just great thinkers, I think. And it's interesting because I fancy myself more of an empath and more of an emotional being than a thinker. And over time, I feel like I've proven to myself that I'm both. And even though I still feel inherently more of an emotional being. And I think that one doesn't preclude, right? Like the other, I think. And so I've become more balanced in some ways. And so to this question of, okay, so definitely he was a starting point for me, but not, I've gone, I think, since him beyond that. And I think a lot of what's helped the growth of my evolution in this way of thinking, of this way of being in a relationship, comes from abolitionist work, comes from transformation justice work, and so I want to kind of couch this part of the conversation. And so I think that so I love the Daniel Tiger segue, because it is, I think that's the difference to kind of zero in on, is that there is a difference between an apology and accountability. An apology is a part of accountability, is generally the first step in taking accountability for a wrong that you have done. And if you can look it up, and there are a million, articles on a good apology, and they differ depending on, on who's written the article and what, what body they're sort of referencing. But generally you're apologizing at first, right? You want to hear the "I'm sorry," of course. But then you go on to sort of state, what is your understanding of what you did wrong? Because I think that's fundamental. Your understanding of what it is that you think you did wrong may be completely different than what the other person feels like you did that harmed them. And I think that if at that step there's still an incongruence, that's going to unfortunately lead to more conversation, which again is something that people who are scared
well, and then
don't want to do,
especially now. And then when you get to the whole, and this is another one of those layers of learning, where you and I were just talking about this, and I want to talk to this later in the conversation. But how many people they think that they transition from childhood to adulthood, but really so many people are just walking around in their 30s, 40s, and 50s as just really old adolescents.
Yes.
But one of those realizations is that, and it's a cliche now, but it's still true. Intent does not equal impact.
Right.
And so how many times have I apologized and said, that's not what I meant to do? It should matter. And of course it matters. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter, but regardless of one's intent, when harm is done, the harm is real. And it doesn't matter what your intent was, because the action took place and the harm was done. And so as part of the apology, that was huge for me, that I don't get to determine the impact of what I do. That's not mine to determine. That's not mine to control. That's not mine to regulate. That's not mine to be angry at you now for being angry at me.
Yeah.
Because I can embody that state right now. I can feel that frustration of, why are you getting mad at me for apologizing?
Right.
And so that's another one of those huge just light bulbs. It doesn't matter what, not that I don't want to say it that strongly. The intent is not the same as the impact.
Right. And let's be real, most people don't care and don't consider the impact. And that's part of the problem.
Right.
Is that we're inherently taught to be our number ones. We don't think collectively. We don't think about impact beyond ourselves. And in that way, that's one of the things that that unfortunately has become one of my gauges for, for do I want to be in a relationship with this person?
Yeah.
Is what is the level of self-centeredness that they come with, because that's a measure of maturity.
Yeah, and I can tell you how many times have we felt like party poopers because we are not having fun if we're watching a TV show or a comedy act, or we're at some sort of performance that is harmful, right? It's the monologue or the joke or the punchline is at the expense of something. And, this is very in the moment of like cancel culture and things like that, when that mode of operation is still very adolescent. It's still very immature. And I think that we have moved into this phase of really actively seeking harm avoidance. And and in fact, healing.
Yes. Yeah. And I think, not everybody is at the same place. And, and I think that it's different, because if you have a level of security and of safety in a group, and like, then you can, right? Then you can make those jokes and have them feel safe, because that person is not a harmful person. They're not perpetuating harm. Even if it's like a distasteful or a raunchy joke or whatever it is, right? Like, there's a level of trust that has to exist between people. And for me, most of those conditions are not met in a lot of spaces. In fact, a lot of spaces I've found over and over, like, I'm not feeling safe. Because I'm not. It's not something that I'm imagining. It's something that's happening in real time. I've gotten to the point where trusting that intuition has saved me so many times, and continues to kind of awe me. But yeah, I think, in the end, like, it doesn't matter that you didn't intend to cause harm if that's what you did. And if you can't even be vulnerable enough to name the thing that you did, it means that you don't even know, right? Like, you don't know what it is that I'm actually upset about. So how can we even have a conversation about this? How can you truly be sorry about this thing that hurt me? And how, and then another further on, like, how are you taking ownership? Right? Because that's kind of like the next step, really, is it's like, here's what I did, and not trying to create excuses for it, because that's part of that thing that you're kind of hitting on the nail. Is I want to explain myself. I want to say why what I did isn't as bad as it seems, or why it wasn't intended. And and I do want to say, like, the caveat here is that, I was having a separate conversation, not about apologies and not about fucking up with somebody else, where, some of what they were saying is, well, you don't get to tell me, how I feel. My feelings are valid, sort of thing. And I'm like, absolutely. Like, my feelings, your feelings, everybody's feelings are valid. However, the feelings that you have may be based in incorrect information. In which case, it is absolutely causing further distress than it should be. And are you willing to then listen to me when I'm telling you, like, I hear you, and I'm not trying to invalidate what it is that you say you're feeling. And what you're feeling is based on this, like, false narrative that you've created to whatever, right? Most of the time it's to spare yourself from having to feel like you're a bad person because you're doing these bad things, and I think that's a lot of what we see in lack of accountability and lack of ownership, is this sort of stance of I've caused this hurt and pain, and I can't square that with who I think I am, right? Because I want to be the hero of the story. I want to be the person who gets it right all the time, and nobody gets it right all the time, like nobody. And then I think, like, if we've gotten to that point where, like, I truly feel like you understand me, like you see me, you can kind of tell me what it is that really hurt me and take ownership for it. What are you going to do? What are you going to do about it now? Like, what are the steps that you're going to take to ensure it doesn't happen again? And then once you have figured that out, like, what is the repair work that you're going to do with me? Because what you're going to do to ensure that it doesn't happen isn't just for me, it's for you. And it's for anybody else who comes after me. Maybe not for me. Maybe for me, this situation is irreparable. I don't know, right? Like, I might be in a state where I'm so hurt that I'm still in the state where I need to do my own healing around it to figure out whether I'm ever going to be in a place where we can get back to a place of trust and of being in relation. Regardless, in the very least, it means that boundaries shift, whether that be for a time or whether it be permanent. Boundaries are going to shift, relationships shift when people mess up, because on some level it's rocked this sort of like trust that there was between us, right? And I mean, there's small fuck ups and then there's big fuck ups, right? But the problem is that not being able to handle these small mistakes, these small sort of tears at the fabric of trust eventually kind of builds up, right? And also, if you feel compelled to make a lot of small mistakes and creating a lot of small harms, you're a lot more likely to kind of build up to larger ones as well, And so, are you willing to listen to the repair that it is I'm asking for? And is it within the realm of something that you feel like you can actually do? And can you be honest about that? Because I think that then there's also the possibility of negotiating. If I say what I would really like for you to do is, I don't know, like, tell all our loved ones what happened, I don't know. It could be something like that. Or, move out for a period of 6 months. It can be anything. It can be depending on the harm, depending on, what happened. I think that within relationships, the one that comes to mind a lot is for folks, I think, who are in like sort of like traditional monogamous relationships, like concepts of like affairs, right? Like that kind of thing, or mismanagement of money is a big one. Not speaking to your partner and taking huge risks with money might be one that feels irreparable for some people, particularly if it means that now your entire family's like finances are unstable. It might mean that the person's asking for you to not be the person managing the finances for a year. You put your paycheck into the bank, and I'll handle like paying all the bills and making sure that everything is taken care of. Whatever it is, the agreement that feels good. And then that person might be defensive, right? Defensiveness, I think, is probably the number one sign that this person is not ready to take accountability for their actions.
And what does that look? What does defensiveness look like most often?
Often a lot like what you were mentioning with your dad, right? Like there's sometimes there's yelling. Immediately there's a desire to want to explain away and to minimize. There's lots of depending on how toxic the dynamic is, it can include any number of, like, it can include turning the tables and enumerating the amounts of things that you think that the other person has done wrong, right, as a way of like illegitimizing what they're saying.
Yep.
Is like, well, who are you to to say that I've done something wrong? Look at all the things you've done wrong, right? Like turning the criticism around on the other person.
And they're all just ways of deflecting from having to actually talk about the thing.
Yes.
Because and I think a lot of what we're talking about comes to, I mean, because let's just cut to the chase. The vast majority, I would say, or at least, I would say it. The vast majority of people who we would call, who fall into these patterns of fuck ups, are people socialized as men, and are very firmly shrouded in toxic masculinity. And so to have to acknowledge mistakes, to have to acknowledge that harm has been done, to have to cede control of things, to have to, yes, part of apologizing and doing repair work is having to continuously talk about the things over and over and over and over again until, and even beyond, the person who has received the harm feels as if it is healed. And all of those things go directly against the grain of what traditional masculine behavior looks like. And that it's about control. It's about power. Not necessarily overpowering the partner, but just having the power to decide when something is done. We're done with this conversation.
Yes.
We don't need to talk about this anymore. We've talked about it to death. And every time we talk about it, we end up in the exact same place.
Yes.
So it's power, it's control, it's dominance of the narrative. It's an inability to acknowledge weaknesses. It's an inability to be introspective.
Yeah, self-awareness.
Because to look in is to be vulnerable.
It's scary.
And it's terrifying because by the time the shit has gotten so bad that you actually have to do it, so much harm has been done already. And it's overwhelming. And it's scary. And I think that's really one of the simplest truths, is that because we are never, and this is where it sounds like I'm making excuses, and I'm not making excuses, but it is a truth, that because we have so few role models and so little experience as children being held accountable in this way, that vulnerability is terrifying. And so we're children, and we never learned how to maturely discuss these things. And I don't mean just men at this point. I mean people in general, but especially people socialized as men and who have adopted the patterns of toxic masculinity, and that affects all genders.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, like, it was interesting when you were talking about the, centering like mask folks in that dynamic. I was like, what about white women? Because so I've been at the harmed end of a lot of white women's, like,
because a
dynamics.
lot of white women are holding up traditional masculinity,
right,
as the ideal,
but not just that whiteness, right? Like white supremacy too.
which is part and parcel.
Yeah, and it's conflict aversion.
Yep.
It's, I'm gonna cry my way out of this, right?
It's, why should I be held accountable for the sins of my ancestors?
Well, and what's really interesting too is that with my experience with a lot of, in a lot of those circumstances, is that they're a lot more likely to to offer the apology.
Mm-hmm.
And but it doesn't go very far. So it's the same dynamic. It's the, I'll apologize, I'll say that I see the thing that I did wrong, but there won't be, it's like appeasing. It's very like fawning like behavior. It's, I'll say all the right things so that you'll stop. so that you'll
So
stop.
that we can just please
Can you
stop
just stop talking
just
about
stop
this?
talking about this right now. Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, and I think that the last piece of the, you know, the accountability that we haven't talked about is that, and this is everybody's least favorite part. Everybody's least favorite part, especially like I've gotten really good at like accountability work interpersonally with people that I love, because my ultimate goal is to stay in relationship with people who I love and to do everything possible to, because I, at the end of the day, I want to be able to say I did everything that I could, you know, to make this work.
Mm-hmm.
Because like I, you know, for me, like it's like how can we expect to change culture and society if we can't even be in relationship with one another one-on-one, right? Like, and so that's my ultimate goal is how do we do this right here so that this can serve as a microcosm of how we can do it, you know, for the world at large. And so it's that you don't get to decide when it's over. You don't. The person who's harmed may need to have this conversation a year later. They might need to have it 2 years later. They might need to have it 5 years later. You know, sometimes it's, you know, you hit the anniversary of the thing and there's still a grief that's attached to it, because in essence, like depending on what it was, you may have shifted the trajectory of a relationship in unexpected ways that feel really unfair, you know, and that still hurt, because it was the loss of a possibility. It was the loss of potential. It was the loss of opportunities that you can't get back, you know, and yes, there can be other ones, but not those, right? And that person is allowed to feel that hurt when they need to acknowledge it. And when your response to that is like, oh, well, why aren't you over that? It's like you're doing it again. You're minimizing again, and you're creating a new harm. You know, you're creating further tears at the fabric of that trust that you're rebuilding. And so it's like, well, what do you want? I mean, if you can't do the work of accountability, that's okay. Nobody's going to say, you know, that you didn't try, or that maybe for you it's easier to start from scratch, but that sucks. That sucks. If what you need to do in that moment is burn it all down instead of helping to repair and rebuild, like you can bet your ass that you're going to replay these same dynamics out with a new person. Mm-hmm. And why not put the work in? Why not? You're already that far in. At that point, why not just do the work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you know, those are scary moments when, because they're like storm clouds. Like, you know, when feelings are there. Mm-hmm. You know when there are echoes mm-hmm. in the environment of not the same situations, but, you know, the similarities that are causing those moments and those memories to resurface. Mm-hmm. And I want to do something about it. I want to say, look, it's better now. Look how much things mm-hmm. are better. Look how much I've grown. Look how much you've grown. Look how much we've grown. But those moments are inescapable. They are going to come back. Mm-hmm. And they are painful, because they do force us to relive those very very painful experiences. And I think it's part of growing through harm is acknowledging the harm.
Mm-hmm.
And there is no bystander in that.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's done, if the conversation is honest, and if the work is being done by both parties, then those moments of shared pain at that point
Mm-hmm.
can be part of the healing process and bring people closer together.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of what motivates the fuck up is insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the echoes, and you see the storm clouds, and I see you sad or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and I ask what's going on, and you might say, oh, it's coming up on the anniversary of whatever, or I'm feeling that loss again. And you're not saying I'm doing anything right now to cause it.
Yeah.
But I still feel that because
Mm-hmm.
I caused the wound to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, at that moment, I have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Do I center myself and say, and go down that path of reliving the fuck up again,
Mm-hmm.
and centering myself and beating myself up and continuing the shame and perpetuating that cycle of nasty? Or do I embrace the hurt because it hurts?
Mm-hmm.
And do I share the hurt with you?
Mm-hmm.
And then do I let you hurt with me? And then we just talk about it. That's it for this episode. But stay tuned for the second half of our conversation about fucking up. Thanks for listening. If you have questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, feel free to share them with me via social media, email me at finloslives@gmail.com, or you can leave a voice message via the SpeakPipe app at finloslives.com. If you enjoyed this content, I hope you'll share the podcast. I look forward to our next conversation.